History feels solid. Dates, wars, names, timelines. We're taught to believe it's all settled, locked in, unquestionable. But every once in a while, a crack appears, a coincidence that feels too perfect, a detail that doesn't quite fit. And once you notice it, you can't unsee it. What if one of the most important wars of the 19th century wasn't misunderstood, but fabricated? What if the story we were taught was built from fragments of a much later conflict, stitched together to fill a gap no one wanted to talk about? This isn't about denying history. It's about questioning whether the timeline itself makes sense. Official history presents the 19th century as a clean sequence. Napoleon rises, Europe burns, Russia is invaded, Moscow is abandoned, and the world moves on. Then, decades later, another war. Different names, different dates, different textbooks. But when you start lining these events up side by side, something unsettling happens. The stories begin to overlap. Not thematically, not symbolically, mechanically, as if the same script was run twice. Coincidences happen, patterns repeat, but repetition has limits, and the 19th century seems to cross them again and again. Take the rulers. The revolutions that remove them, the length of their reigns, the political forces that overthrow them, even the way their lives end afterward. When these biographies are layered over one another, they don't just rhyme, they align, almost perfectly. Same sequence, same duration, same outcome. Change the names, shift the dates, and the story stays intact. This alone would be strange, but it doesn't stop there. Look at the wars themselves. During what we're told was the early 1800s, nearly all of Europe is mobilized against Russia. Massive coalitions, endless campaigns, a continent at war. Then, just a few decades later, history tells us it happens again. Another pan-European coalition, another Napoleon, another Russia, another Alexander, another Constantine. Same roles, same sides, same outcome. The probability of history repeating that exact configuration twice is vanishingly small. Wars don't just recur like reruns of a play. Logistics change, technology changes, strategy evolves. And yet the structure remains eerily fixed. And that's where the cracks start to widen. Because when you examine the logistics of the famous invasion of Russia, the official story begins to fall apart. We're told that hundreds of thousands of soldiers marched across Europe on foot, dragging supplies through mud, forests, and endless terrain, straight toward Moscow. This image is deeply ingrained. It's cinematic, heroic, miserable, and completely irrational. The same military powers both before and after this war relied heavily on naval logistics. Entire armies were transported by sea. Equipment, artillery, food, and horses moved efficiently using fleets. This wasn't experimental, it was standard practice. So why suddenly, in the most ambitious campaign of the era, did every commander collectively forget the ocean existed? Why abandon the fastest, safest, most reliable method of moving massive forces and instead choose the slowest and most exhausting possible route? There is no good answer. Unless the invasion didn't happen the way we were told. If forces entered Russia primarily through waterways rather than overland marches, the geography suddenly makes sense. Rivers become highways, supply lines become manageable. Strategic locations like Crimea transform from side notes into central keys. Control the mouths of major rivers, and you control access to the interior. And once you consider this possibility, another strange detail emerges. If massive battles really occurred deep inside Russia, there should be physical evidence, weapons, ammunition, debris. War leaves scars that don't just vanish just because a textbook says so. And that evidence exists. Across vast regions where no official battles are supposed to have taken place, modern searchers continue to find ammunition that doesn't belong there. Not just any ammunition, but advanced mid-19th century bullets designed for rifled weapons. Ammunition that, according to official history, did not exist during the early 1800s in mass use. Yet it's there. In forests, in fields, near cities that were supposedly untouched by foreign armies. This creates an impossible choice. Either weapon technology appeared decades earlier than we're told, contradicting the entire history of military development, or the battles attributed to the early 19th century actually occurred much later. And once you accept that possibility, everything else begins to rearrange itself. The wars in Europe, the conflicts in the Americas, the simultaneous upheavals across continents. History presents them as separate struggles, isolated causes, independent revolutions. But viewed together, they look less like scattered events and more like fragments of a single global catastrophe. A world-spanning conflict, or something even worse. Written records from the period don't bring clarity. They bring confusion. Entire wars officially lasted years, yet produced almost no large-scale documented battles. Casualty numbers that barely register. Descriptions that feel deliberately vague. Conflicts labeled as wars that look more like placeholders. Why name something so insignificant a war unless something far larger was being hidden behind it? Eyewitness accounts only deepen the mystery. Descriptions of troops armed with bows and arrows appearing alongside modern artillery. Entire formations described as psychological weapons meant to terrify, not fight. It sounds less like a conventional war and more like the collision of two different eras happening at the same time. And then there are the cities. Descriptions of abandoned capitals, streets emptied, entire populations gone, not displaced temporarily, but absent. Letters describe endless quarantines blocking travel, weeks of isolation just to move along a single road, measures that make no sense for ordinary warfare, but perfect sense for something else. Epidemics, contamination, fear of invisible death. Early photographs seem to confirm it. Vast cities captured in eerie silence, no crowds, no traffic, no life. We're told it's because of long exposure times, but shadows remain sharp, stationary objects are crisp. The emptiness looks real because it probably was. Something happened. Something big enough to empty cities, disrupt generations, erase records, and force later historians to reconstruct a past they didn't fully understand. And when reconstruction replaces memory, duplication becomes inevitable. Events are copied, dates are shifted, names are changed. A second version of the past is assembled to cover the hole left behind. That may be why the 19th century feels like a hall of mirrors. Duplicate wars, duplicate leaders, duplicate disasters, duplicate recoveries, even duplicate cultural figures whose lives and creative output seem split across time like reflections of a single source. This isn't proof, not yet, but it is a pattern, and patterns demand explanation. In the next part, we'll follow the physical evidence deeper, the bullets, the maps, the geography that refuses to cooperate with the official story, and the uncomfortable possibility that what we call the 19th century wars were not separate events at all, but fragments of one continuous catastrophe, cut apart, renamed, and buried under layers of narrative. Because if history was rewritten once, the real question isn't how, it's why. If part 1 cracked the surface, this is where things get uncomfortable. Because patterns are one thing, physical evidence is another. Stories can be argued, timelines can be debated, but objects buried in the ground don't care what textbooks say. They simply exist. Across enormous areas of Eastern Europe and Russia, modern searchers keep finding something that shouldn't be there, not occasionally, not accidentally, in massive quantities. Advanced conical bullets designed for rifled firearms, ammunition known to historians by a very specific name, bullets that became standard only in the middle of the 19th century. According to official history, these bullets did not exist during the early 1800s in widespread use. Armies at that time relied mostly on smoothbore muskets firing round lead balls. The technological leap that introduced this new ammunition is well documented, or at least it's supposed to be. So why are these bullets found far from where mid-century wars supposedly happened? Not just near Crimea, not just near coastal battlefields. They appear near Moscow, near St. Petersburg, in regions that textbooks insist never saw foreign troops, even farther inland, deep into territories that were supposedly untouched by European armies. This isn't a scatter of lost artifacts, it's a map, a violent one, a map that refuses to match official battle diagrams. There are only two explanations, and neither is comfortable. Either weapon technology advanced decades earlier than we are told, collapsing the accepted timeline of military development, or the battles associated with these bullets occurred much later than the dates assigned to them. You can't have it both ways. And once you accept that something is wrong with the dating, geography starts to speak louder. The official narrative insists on massive overland marches, endless columns moving through mud, forests, and hostile terrain. Yet the distribution of physical evidence doesn't follow roads. It follows rivers, waterways, natural arteries that slice deep into the continent. This is how 19th century empires actually fought, not by dragging entire armies across land when water was available. They used fleets, gunboats, shallow draft vessels armed with artillery. Rivers weren't obstacles, they were highways. Control a river and you control supply, food, ammunition, reinforcements. The land moves for you. When you apply this logic to Russia, a different picture emerges. Southern access points suddenly become critical. Crimea stops looking like a side campaign and starts looking like the key. Control the peninsula, and you control entry into the heart of the country through major rivers. This would explain why supposedly separate wars share the same geography, why the same strategic regions keep reappearing under different names, why the same battles seem to happen twice, decades apart, with eerily similar outcomes. It would also explain why official logistics never quite add up. Because if the invasion happened primarily by water, not land, the famous image of an army marching thousands of kilometers collapses. That image may not be history. It may be theater. And then there's the silence. For wars that supposedly reshaped continents, the documentation is strangely thin. Some conflicts officially lasted years, yet produced almost no large-scale recorded engagements. Casualty numbers that barely rise above skirmishes, naval wars with almost no major naval battles, campaigns described vaguely, as if details were deliberately blurred. Why call something a war if almost nothing about it looks like one? Unless the real events were too large, too chaotic, or too damaging to record honestly. Eyewitness accounts that do survive feel out of place. Reports of troops armed with bows and arrows appearing alongside modern firearms. Units described less as combat forces and more as psychological tools meant to terrify. This isn't how conventional armies behave. It sounds like the collision of different technological levels at once, as if old-world forces were being thrown into a modern war they didn't belong in. Then come the cities. Again and again, accounts describe major population centers completely abandoned, not partially evacuated, not temporarily cleared, empty. Streets silent, homes left behind, capitals reduced to ghost towns. The official explanation is patriotic sacrifice, noble refusal to live under occupation. It's a powerful story, but it doesn't survive basic scrutiny.
Mass civilian evacuations on that scale require time, coordination, and motivation stronger than ideology. Fear does that, not pride. Fear of something invisible, something contagious, something lethal. Letters from the era mention endless quarantines, multiple isolation zones along major roads, weeks spent confined just to travel a short distance. These are not wartime security measures. They are epidemic protocols. Poetry from the period doesn't describe heroic defiance. It describes death, emptiness, cities that feel more like tombs than capitals. And then photography enters the record. Early photography from the mid-19th century show enormous cities devoid of people. We're told this is a technical illusion caused by long exposure times, but that explanation collapses when stationary objects cast sharp shadows and solitary figures appear frozen in place.
You don't erase entire populations with exposure time. What these images resemble is aftermath, a world recently emptied. When you combine this with the physical evidence in the ground, the logistical absurdities, the duplicated wars, and the mirrored biographies, a disturbing hypothesis begins to take shape. What if the 19th century wasn't a sequence of separate conflicts, but one prolonged global crisis? A catastrophe so destructive that it fractured memory itself. A disaster whose true scale was later divided into smaller, safer stories. Wars became multiple wars. Fires became separate fires. Leaders became different leaders. The same events replayed under different names to make the timeline look continuous. And if that's true, then the problem wasn't just war. It was survival. In the final part, we'll confront the most unsettling questions of all. Why literature from the era feels more like eyewitness testimony than historical reconstruction. Why culture, politics, and even music appear duplicated across time. And why someone would go to such extraordinary lengths to rewrite an entire century. Because if history was edited this deeply, it wasn't to confuse us. It was to make sure we never asked what really happened.
By now, the question isn't whether something feels wrong. It's how deep the distortion goes. Because when physical evidence, logistics, eyewitness accounts, and geography all point in the same direction, coincidence stops being a useful explanation. And that's where culture enters the story, not as decoration, but as testimony. If the 19th century experienced a catastrophe so severe that memory itself fractured, then we shouldn't just see traces of it in wars and ruins. We should see it in art, in literature, in the people who lived through it. And we do. One name stands above all others: Leo Tolstoy. We are taught to see him as a novelist, a genius reconstructing the past through imagination and archives, but that framing quietly ignores something critical. Tolstoy wasn't writing about a war he never saw. He was an artillery officer who fought in the Crimean War. He lived inside siege warfare. He watched cities burn. He understood fear, chaos, logistics, and death, not as abstractions, but as daily reality. His earliest works are openly documentary. They describe the Crimean War exactly as he experienced it. The tone is raw, observational, precise. And then he writes War and Peace, a novel supposedly about events that happened decades earlier. Yet the battlefield descriptions feel too real, too detailed, too psychologically accurate. The technology, the movement of troops, the emotional rhythm of war, it all aligns far more closely with mid-19th century warfare than with the early 1800s we're told he was depicting. What if he wasn't reconstructing history? What if he was disguising it? By shifting names, dates, and locations, Tolstoy could describe what he saw while avoiding political consequences. Censorship doesn't just silence people. Sometimes it forces them to speak in code. And once you consider that, other oddities fall into place. Diplomatic moments that read more like theater than reality. Meetings staged on rafts in the middle of rivers with no witnesses. Critical documents conveniently missing. Monuments erected long after the events they supposedly commemorate. When written sources become unreliable, monuments become tools. Not evidence of memory, but instruments of narrative control. And then there are the fires. Official history treats the great fires of the 19th century as separate disasters. Different cities, different decades, different causes, but the descriptions are eerily similar. Total destruction, social collapse, looting, silence afterward. Even the recovery patterns repeat. After major fires, decades pass. Then suddenly, identical institutions appear. New systems of measurement, new administrative structures, new attempts to impose order on chaos. The same solutions applied again and again, as if responding to the same underlying event. This repetition extends beyond disasters. Biographies begin to blur. Statesmen with nearly identical careers, same ideological positions, same offices, same duration of power, same timing relative to major wars, even similar lifespans. Change the names, shift the dates, the structure stays intact. Artists, too. Composers born the same number of years before different wars. Short, tragic lives.
Creative output divided strangely between vocal and instrumental forms, as if one body of work was split across multiple identities. This isn't how organic history behaves. It's how reconstructed history behaves, like a mosaic rebuilt from fragments whose original order was lost. Which brings us to the hardest question of all. Why? Why invent duplicate wars? Why clone leaders? Why fracture a century into overlapping reflections? There are only a few plausible answers. One possibility is ignorance, a catastrophe so devastating that records were destroyed, archives burned, and generations wiped out. When later historians tried to reconstruct the past, they didn't have enough information, so they filled the gaps, not maliciously, but desperately. Memory was replaced with narrative. Another possibility is far darker. What if the catastrophe involved technology far beyond what we associate with the early 19th century? Weapons capable of mass destruction. Events that left physical scars still misidentified today as natural formations. Empty cities not abandoned temporarily, but depopulated permanently. Such a truth would shatter the idea of linear progress. It would suggest that advanced technology existed, was used, and then deliberately erased from memory. A third possibility is power. A collapse creates opportunity. If authority changes hands illegally, through conquest, occupation, or something even stranger, then history must be rewritten to legitimize the new order. Dynasties invented, lineages extended backward, wars reframed as ancient struggles instead of recent coups. Control the past and you control the present. The final possibility is a combination of all of them. A real catastrophe, followed by amnesia, followed by reconstruction, followed by manipulation. The result is what we now call the 19th century.
A timeline that looks solid until you touch it. And here's the most unsettling part. If this much distortion exists in a period barely 2 centuries behind us, an era with photography, printed books, and modern states, then what does that say about older history, about antiquity, about the deep past? If one century could be rewritten, others could too. This isn't about replacing one story with another. It's about learning to recognize the signs of fabrication, duplicate events, mirrored biographies, physical evidence that doesn't match the narrative, logistics that defy reality. History isn't just what we're told. It's what survives scrutiny. And the moment we stop questioning, someone else starts deciding what we're allowed to remember. If this investigation made you uncomfortable, that's a good sign. Discomfort is often the first step toward clarity. In the next exploration, we'll examine tangible evidence even more closely, maps, artifacts, and anomalies that refuse to stay buried. If you don't want to miss that, make sure you're subscribed and notifications are on. Share this with anyone who believes history is settled. And remember, the past doesn't disappear. It gets edited. And sometimes, the truth is still waiting right under our feet.